Simon is completing his PhD at Winchester, and he's an expert in pantomime. So obviously pantomime has been one of the main vehicles for representing China on the stage throughout the 19th century, particularly with Aladdin. But Simon's going to be talking about a production that was put on in 82. Mm-hmm. I was going to say this late 70s, but it's 82.
82, yeah.
And which makes links to 19th century pantomime and contemporary politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Yes, picking up on some of those themes that Anne mentioned, history impacting the contemporary. For many people in Britain, a visit to the Christmas pantomime constitutes their first experience of the theatre. Not only is it the first time a child will often encounter the spectacle of live performance, with its sparkling scenery, its toe-tapping musical numbers, glorious costumes, and of course plenty of comic capers, but it's also the first and perhaps only time that many will experience a representation of China on the British stage in the form, of course, of popular pantomime title Aladdin. Aladdin was first produced as a pantomime in 1788 at Covent Garden, a favourite of producers and audience members alike for its opportunity of exotic spectacle. The modern pantomime version of the tale is set in Peking, where a poor laundress's son falls in love with the Princess of China. With a little help from a magic lamp, Aladdin wins the love of his life and defeats the wicked Abanazar, an evil sorcerer who had high hopes of being the most powerful being in the universe. Now, over the past 244 pantomime seasons, the title has evolved greatly. And in recent years, producers and pantomime writers have come up with new interpretations of the title in order to distance themselves from these overtly Orientalist productions of the past. This year, for example, we'll see the title role Aladdin dispensed with completely when at the Olympia Theatre in Dublin, Jedward and the Magic Lamp is staged, with the X Factor brothers taking over the principal boy's role. With Britain a much more multicultural society than when Aladdin was first produced, pantomime has been forced to change in order to stay relevant and contemporary. Now, along with Cinderella, Aladdin is the most frequently produced of all the many pantomime titles. This coming season, it accounts for 20% of the UK's top 3 pantomime producers' titles and 15% of the entire season. Kudos Entertainment, for producing 24 pantomimes this season, expect 1.5 million people to see their productions. But not only is the title popular at home, pantomime versions of Aladdin have also been seen in Canada, South Africa, Jamaica and Singapore. As Anne Richard writes, and if only I had a book to do the same thing that Don Chin had then, the enduring popularity of Aladdin can be ascribed to it having become a vehicle for ways of thinking about China and Chinese people. And it's this very notion this paper sets out to address in relation to Peter Nichols' pantomime Poppy, which was set during the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and written all those many years after Aladdin's very own pantomime debut. In today's paper, I want to revisit Britain in the 1980s, a time when, as Benjamin Poore states, the social and political upheavals of the late 20th century generated new theatrical forms with which to interrogate and reassess the Victorian past. Poore argues that the way that we regard ourselves in the present, the way we represent the past on stage tells us much about how we regard ourselves in the present. And it's this very notion that I want to explore today in relation to Peter Nichols' Poppy, presented by the RSC in 1982. In September 1982, the Royal Shakespeare Company moved into their new home at the Barbican in the City of London. The theatre, which had been designed in consultation with the company, would become their London base until 2002 and see them present a variety of different productions alongside their usual programming of Shakespeare. Having already written 2 pieces for the RSC, Peter Nichols' third constituted the first new piece of work for the company's new home, and just as with his music hall-inspired A Day in the Death of Joe Egg and musical revue-style piece Privates on Parade, Nichols turned to yet another popular entertainment form for his third RSC commission to create the political pantomime Poppy. Set in the mid-1800s, Poppy's narrative echoes that of pantomime Dick Whittington, with Dick setting off to seek his fortune in London. There, he meets Obadiah Upward, a rising merchant who explains that they could make their fortune in China through the sale of opium. Off they sail to British India to harvest the poppy fields with the hope of striking a deal with China. But when they discover the Emperor of China has forbidden the trade, Dick is forced to search for new markets and ways to import his precious cargo. Full of anger at the British's actions, the Chinese besiege the European compound and the Opium War breaks out, which results in a win for Britain and the acquisition of Hong Kong Island to its territories. In the pantomime, Hong Kong citizens are all addicted to opium at this point, much like the piece's principal girl and the Emperor of China's son, but at least Dick Whittington ends up wealthy, having achieved his goal of becoming a self-made man. Now, in the 1982 published play text, Poppy is described as using all the resources of the traditional British pantomime to tell the essentially serious, ultimately devastating story of the mid-19th century Opium Wars. However, although Poppy has been described as a pantomime and utilises many of the genre's conventions, it neither constitutes the expected family-orientated retelling of a familiar narrative, or with its tales of war, exploitation, and murdering of the pantomime horse, and nor was its production scheduled for a festive run originally. So why was pantomime chosen to present a piece with such a quasi-historical narrative? Well, in a programme note for the 1983 West End revival, Nichols writes, "Of course, Panto was in its prime imperialist spectacle, made for the Victorian mood, and for us it needs new themes, stories and moods, new ironies, and why only at Christmas, and why only for kids? Why no politics?" As Jim Davis has argued, pantomime at Drury Lane at the turn of the century appeared to celebrate Britain's imperial strength and to support or encourage patriotism within its audience. Davis cites the Star, which, writing about the Drury Lane pantomimes in 1900, refers to them as a national institution, a symbol of our empire, before criticising them with this following sentence: "Only a great nation could have done such a thing. Only an undisciplined one would have done it." Nichols' use of pantomime, therefore, is knowingly ironic, as he employs a form once described as patriotic, a national institution, a symbol of empire, to critique these very things the Victorian pantomimes once celebrated. Now, in Poppy, Nichols challenges the expectation of a happy ending by way of shattering pantomime's usually utopian setting and subverting a number of the genre's conventions. Nichols' characters, as you can see here, strongly adhere to pantomime stock roles, but rather than merely being lifted from Dick Whittington, many receive new identities, often ghosting and representing those figures from history in order to criticise both Victorian and 1982 society. In many pantomime titles, of course, it is the immortals with their rhyming couplets who establish the narrative frame and set up the story by way of a battle between good and evil. Nichols, in Poppy, chooses Queen Victoria and the Emperor of China as his two immortals, battling it out over who should be crowned the most favoured nation. This framework allows Nichols to present Britain and China as opposing forces. As the pantomime's fairy, Queen Victoria's first appearance, by way of a trap holding her orb and sceptre, makes such an entrance interesting because Nichols is inviting the audience not only to assess their understanding of the genre's conventions, where a trap is usually reserved for the villain to connote an ascent from hell, but to question Victoria's supposed good fairy actions, which include declarations of war and the subsequent exploitation of a nation. Much like Aladdin's pantomime villain Abanazar, who disguises himself in order to gain the magic lamp, Victoria too adopts such a course, appearing first as a statue, unable to assist the peasant's plight in done roaming on the down. Next she appears as a missionary, and then later as the rather ironically entitled Miss Fortune. Presented in this way, Nichols paints Victoria as an omnipresent and omnipotent figure, deeply embedded in and responsible for Britain's exploitative and brutal actions, whilst using this disguise motive to further connote villainy and mistrust. As Victoria Radian commented in The Observer, Nichols doesn't, however, make the mistake of turning the Chinese into the goodies. But he does present them as non-villains, more civilised and respectful than the cutthroat British who want to make money out of the illegal trade of opium and thereby inflict free trade on China. In contrast, Victoria's apparent nemesis, the Emperor of China, usually found as a comical, bumbling despot in the pantomime Aladdin, is here depicted robed and splendid in a throne floating high above, connoting perhaps superiority and power. In employing such a subversive approach, the pantomime's prologue sets the theatrical frame for the evening, challenging the audience's horizon of expectations and inviting them to reassess their understanding of pantomime and Britain's history. As John Elsom surmises in his Mail on Sunday review, Nichols wanted to use the device of a tatty, patriotic panto ironically, even bitterly, to remind us that our entertainment has deep roots in our imperialism. Nichols' approach of pitching China against Britain and vice versa enables him through pantomime to explore some of the constructs of Orientalism. As Edward Said wrote, identity is a construction involved in establishing opposites and others, the processes of which Poppy hopes to depict. And indeed, this stark contrast between the two nations is immediately felt when one considers the production scenography depicted in this image here, taken from the 1983 West End revival. Whereas the British here wear hunting regalia and white, which enforces the boldness of the Union flag's red, white and blue, China is depicted as a golden land of mystery and fantasy. Flowing robes are contrasted with trousers, or the lack thereof in the case of the principal boy. An open gilded parasol contrasts with a closed Union flag umbrella. Unfolded fans in the background provide an interesting comparison to what appears to be a weapon or a pointing cane in the hand of the merchant Obadiah upward in the centre. The British appear threatening, a pack of imperial hunters ready to brand any item, including Dick Whittington's underpants there, with their Union flag, and in doing so, claim them as their own. Of course, scenography is just one aspect of cultural representation in Poppy. And now I'd like to have a look at some other ways that Nichols presents these two cultures in order to, as Richard Cave suggests, stimulate new political insight for his audience. Now in Poppy, the British characters constantly refer to the Chinese using derogatory terms such as, and I quote, chinks and coolies. The British are presented as having no respect for other cultures. And in the words of Queen Victoria, the character that is, they believe it's their duty to, quote, raise China's morals till they are level with Cheapside's. Cheapside, of course, being one of London's major trade hubs and thus a place of questionable morals itself. So Nichols there is digging at that. And this moral questioning is reflected later in Poppy when, dressed in more Union flags and imperialist regalia, Francis King describes an episode that occurs. And I quote, the English are shown descending on China with a Bible in one hand and a cash book or a rifle in the other, symbols of their imperial quest. Now, their rousing chorus entitled the Blessed Trinity, in which they proclaim only civilization, commerce, and Christianity will save the Chinese, who in their eyes are in need of being baptized, commercialized, and civilized, serves to expose the real motives between Britain's actions and paint the British as the real savages. In presenting such depictions of the British and Chinese cultures and society, audience members are invited to construct their own readings of the two cultures based on their observations. However, as W.B. Worthing states, much like in the work of Brecht, Nichols clearly indicates to them, the audience, what conclusion their thought should read. Now, in order for Nichols to get his message across, he provides the Chinese with a voice of their own to retaliate against the British racist and exploitative comments. The British are described as a rugged tribe of savages who, in the words of the Emperor, import foreign shit. The derogatory term for Westerners, and I apologize for my pronunciation here, fangui, is also used by the Chinese characters, which translates as barbarian devils. And it's this view of the British that Nichols hoped audience members would embrace, and in doing so feel, as John Elsom wrote in his review, ashamed of Britain's colonial past and actions. But as well as the production's scenography and text, another way Nichols imparts his message is through his clever use of song, with Poppy's musical numbers revelling in and utilising pantomime's topsy-turvydom. Now, one of the most significant examples of this can be found in the musical number They All Look the Same to Us, which I'd like to play to you now. Now, before I do, I'd just like to mention, you don't have all of the lyrics on this slide here because it would just mess the slide up, and I wanted to give you sort of the most important parts. This is sung by the Chinese characters, and hopefully technology will allow us to have a listen.
We describe all savages as Frankie, but there are innumerable races. English,
Spanish,
Turkey, Frenchy, Yankee, coming from as many different places. They all look the same to us, scarlet face and yellow hair, noses too conspicuous, eyes that permanently stare. In a word, they're barbarous, and they look the same to us. With their tied-up legs they walk gracefully as buffalo. Through their broken teeth they talk, silver-tongued as any crow, sounding all the same to us. When they eat they wage a kind of battle. Whatever for? Using swords to tear their food apart. Are you sure? Hacking bits off carcasses of cattle. Say no more. Swallowing with warlike cry and fart. Omnivorous and murderous, villainous and inglorious. It's not racial prejudice, for since the day they came to us, it stood up to analysis, methodical and rigorous, and they all look the same. They all look the same. They all look the same to us.
So the musical number sort of honky-tonk melody there is juxtaposed with the character's overtly British, somewhat Oxbridge accent, as through the song the Chinese characters reveal their perception of the British. And I particularly like that line, "Say no more," which is wonderful. Things taken as normal for British citizens, such as wearing trousers or using a knife and fork to eat, are seen as alien by the other culture. And through Nichols' lyrics, he exposes how stereotypes are often based on uncontextualized and misunderstood observations. The scarlet face referring to sunburnt skin, for example. The song, co-written with Monty Norman, reveals how the negative reading of situations can be interpreted as a way of coping with otherness, as the culture in question reads its constructed other, so as to feel superior. Of course, the lyric and title, "They All Look the Same to Us," demonstrates the inability of some cultures to recognize others as individuals, identifying them by common traits and stereotyping by way of general assumptions and sweeping statements. Through the musical number, Nichols invites his audience to question their own perception of British cultures by way of the comical rendering of the British. Produced only a year after the Brixton race riots, which exposed police racism and contributed to the marginalisation of black communities, Poppy's text possessed a certain resonance and suggested that little progress had been made to readdress such outdated views of other cultures, and thereby revealed some of Britain's insecurities at that time. But this anxiety was heightened by perceived threats from not only at home, but also abroad, where other wars raged, as Britain tried to maintain its status as a world leader and global power. Now, as mentioned earlier, Poppy was not scheduled for a Christmas run. However, perhaps we might say fortuitously for the RSC, its September opening in 1982 marked exactly 3 months and 11 days since the end of the Falklands War, the largest air-naval combat since World War II, when Britain sought to liberate its overseas territory after having been invaded by Argentina. Presented at this time, with the Falklands conflict fresh in Britain's national consciousness, the similarities between Queen Victoria and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's goals of making Britain great again and perhaps reasserting its colonial power would have been difficult to ignore, especially considering the piece's dramatic ending, when Victoria transforms for a 4th time into Elizabeth II as the stage becomes a modern version of the same. Thus, Poppy suggests a continuation of societal ideals, issues and problems, and critically addresses the fact that contemporary society has not yet been able to break free from such historical linearity. Now, as Nichols reveals in a foreword to the revised version of Poppy, I quote, My terminus wasn't Canton, but Hong Kong, a barren island we got in 1842 by sending in the gunboats. On her own Far Eastern tour of 1982, our Prime Minister told astonished Chinese signatories that our two countries had friendly relations going back to the 19th century. One might assume from this that she had not been briefed on the history, but I think it more likely she knew about it very well and approved of Lord Palmerston's gunboats as the proper operation of market forces, as Victoria does in the finale. This quotation explicitly links Thatcher to Victoria and offers a comparison between the two leaders by way of Britain's relationship with the Chinese province. Hong Kong became a British colony under Victoria's reign, whilst during Thatcher's premiership, discussions took place which would see Hong Kong signed back to China as part of the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984. As Anne Witchard and many other pantomime historians state, pantomime as a genre offers immediate and specific comment on issues of the moment, from major political crises to everyday trivia. And in terms of Poppy, the future of Hong Kong was one such important issue. In Act 2, Scene 12's dialogue, the following scene plays out after Britain had been declared most favoured nation. We give you Hong Kong Island, to which the dame, Lady Dodo, replies, and we won't let them have it back in a hurry, will we, boys and girls? This knowing line from the pantomime Dame Lady Dodo, talking in the present but situated in the past, suggests a duality of both time and character. She represents both the past and the present. With her aside crossing the time and space boundaries, she breaks the fourth wall, uniting the quasi-historical fictitious stage with that of the audience's contemporary Britain. The choice of Dodo, an extinct bird as the dame's name, connotes an individual out of touch with the era. And as this dialogue suggests, the role may have been interpreted as a representation of Thatcher herself, with her title Lady and not her Iron Lady status. Of course, depicting Thatcher as a man in woman's clothing was often embraced by satirists during her premiership. Spitting images, grotesque male suit puppet Thatcher, which you can see in the bottom just there, was constantly referred to as Sir and possessed an overtly aggressive persona not too dissimilar to that of the dame Lady Dodo in Poppy, who you can see above her. Upon her first entrance, Dodo appears in this hunting and shooting regalia, before speaking the lines, "Anything that moves, I put a bullet in it." In her opening patter, she declares herself as a hideously extinct old bird and asks aloud, "Where did I go wrong?" These three lines could be seen respectively to represent the Falklands War. With "anything that moves, I put a bullet in it," perhaps referring to the sinking of the Belgrano. Her policies, hideously extinct, and her failure when confronted with national striking and increased inflation. Where did I go wrong? Let us remember in 1982, the year of Poppy's premiere, Britain and China began talks regarding the future of Hong Kong. These initial discussions were described as hostile by the press and continued throughout 1984 until an agreement was reached that year, with trade, just as in the Opium Wars, a central factor in those negotiations. A deal was signed which meant Hong Kong would be governed under the One Country, Two Systems agreement, affording the region of Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy to preserve its economic and social systems for 50 years from the date of the handover. Dodo's line, therefore, not only referred to the 1842 acquisition of Hong Kong, but also referenced the significance of Thatcher's contemporary discussions. Now, during Poppy's run at the Barbican, Thatcher expressed her desire to negotiate an extension of the lease, which would expire in 1997. And she stated, "The friendship between Britain and China is good for us and good for the world," whilst further expressing that she was proud to help write a new page in the history of that friendship. 2 years later, in a speech to the unofficial members of the Hong Kong Executive and Legislative Councils, she remarked, "Britain has been responsible for Hong Kong for nearly 150 years. It is an association which is a source of justifiable pride to us all." Emotional vocabulary such as pride and friendship was used persistently by Thatcher to describe the historical relationship between China and Britain and China and Hong Kong. It was this positive spin on what Michael Billington described as Britain's arrogant, greedy and violent colonial history that Nichols sought to criticise, And by way of presenting such a history, he hoped to enlighten his audience about an often forgotten historic episode of Britain's past. As Billington reminded his readers, we, the British, attempted to justify the opium trade by the benefits it brought to India. And as Poppy shows, we were as insensitive then as we apparently still are to ancient Chinese values. Now, pantomime genre conventions dictate, of course, that a certain level of audience participation will be present in the evening's proceedings to help establish this shared community of Pantoland. But in Poppy's community song sheet, not only was the audience invited to sing along, they were also encouraged to partake in their own colonial war. Led by Lady Dodo and her now lover, Obadiah Upward, another character with allusion to Thatcher, in that he, just like Thatcher's father, once owned a grocer's shop, the song sheet divided the audience in two. Nichols' aim was to have one side sing kapow splat, whilst throwing metaphorical grenades at the other, who would then shoot their opponents in return with metaphorical Gatling guns to the tune of rat-a-tat-tat, to act out the storming of the Summer Palace in the Opium Wars. So, I haven't put all the lyrics down to this song, which everyone was encouraged to join in. I won't encourage you to do that today, unless you have a real aim and wish to do that to warm up. But just have a listen to some of the lyrics, which sort of recount the history and sort of fast forward it up to a date. And remember that just after this comes that transformation of Britain into the present, with Victoria moving into Elizabeth II and the whole stage transforming. So I'll just play you the opening section of this.
From the paradise of countless trees, old lasting glories flow. The mighty ruler of the seven seas has left the dragon throne. A British Tommy and a frog shout a sort of catalogue of every antique they throw to their waiting mates below. Jack had shot the peacocks who will dine on Cocoa Man. Tommy catches music box and diamond-studded fan. Jack, this is a dragon from the son of Heaven's throne. Chuck this clock in the wagon, Tom, it's made of precious stone. Our officers' orders are to break anything here we cannot take. The sound you hear's the fusiliers shooting the crystal chandeliers. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, kapow, splat, rat-a-tat-tat, 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 kapow, splat, rat-a-tat-tat. Hip hooray, what a fabulous day, and the whites don't have to pay. Did you ever see such a succulent dish of Chinese takeaway?
So the Chinese takeaway there, referring not to obviously the at the time very popular and still very, very popular today Chinese food takeaways, but to all of those items that were ransacked from the Summer Palace. Audience members, Nichols hoped, would be drawn into the song sheet, embracing it as part of pantomime's fun, without stopping to consider the implications of their actions, and thereby expose some of those mechanisms of nationalism. By singing along and acting out the ransacking of the Summer Palace, this shared community of pantomime, i.e. those on stage and those in the audience, demonstrated their allegiance to the British cause. As Richard Cave writes, the willingness of the mainly adult audience to participate in Poppy can be read as exposing the pro-British view as an ideological construct, dangerous precisely because it is naive, unthinking, uncivilized, a glorification of the will to power. Alongside Dodo and Upward, the audience become co-conspirators, complicit in the looting of the Summer Palace, and by rejoicing hip hooray, they show their support for Britain's actions. And herein lies much of the RSC's production's criticism, as Michael Billington wrote. Far from wringing our withers at a shameful episode from our mercantile past, Poppy leaves the audience in a state of festive gaiety. It provides a good night out rather than a stab at the conscience. The evening seems more a tribute to the RSC's showbiz proficiency than a lambasting attack on the dubious inheritance of the square mile in which the Barbican resides. Poppy, which started out as an acerbic pantomime, has ended up a comforting musical, only slightly to the left of The King and I. However, one critic does counter all the other reviews in terms of audience participation. Writing in the New Statesman, Benedict Nightingale warned his readers, "Don't be misled by the generally kindly reviews. It was a pretty flat opening at the Barbican, even allowing for the presence of critics and those professional first-nighters who would rather die than join in the shouts and choruses demanded by the actors. Perhaps those seated near Nightingale did detect Nichols's message, and having experienced what Cave describes as a dilemma based on political and moral choice, they decided not to join in order to convey that they were, as Elsom wrote, thoroughly ashamed of our colonial past and of the Opium War of 1839 to 1842 in particular. Perhaps it was that the play-attending core audience of the RSC was simply unsure of how to interact. Perhaps they were, as Nightingale suggests, confused or even resentful at the implication that they would join in and that complicity had been assumed. So reports differ greatly to the extent of participation, but most critics agree that although a message was there, the genre of pantomime meant it got hidden in amongst those issues of comedy patter, songs, the sparkle of the scenery. But the fact that Nichols's message did go unnoticed is interesting, as it exposes the mechanics behind patriotism and supports Davis's observations about pantomime at Drury Lane and pantomime as a medium for imperialist propaganda. Nichols was so outraged at the RSC's presentation, he stated he would never write for British theatre again. However, 6 years later, he revisited the piece at the request of the Half Moon Theatre, hoping to create what he termed a custard pie full of razor blades. The production was, as its press release stated, rougher, tougher, shorter, sharper. Away from the glamour and the large-scale budget of the RSC, the small theatre in London's Mile End targeted local unions and residents of Tower Hamlets, along with American tourists, and even considered staging a mock terrorist attack at the National Theatre as part of its political publicity campaign and anti-Thatcher position. Now, if we consider the two productions' graphics here, we can easily see how the Half Moon production bore stronger criticism of Britain's past, superimposing Victoria's head onto a 19th century cartoon depicting the exploitation of China by Britain. And once again, those allusions to Thatcher are there, with them both being portrayed as having men's clothing, and you can see that there with Victoria's head upon the soldier's body. As Mark Steyn noted at the time, a lot can happen in 6 years, and since the RSC's original, Mrs. Thatcher has considerately provided Poppy with an obvious subtitle, a celebration of Victorian values. Of course, this celebration was highly ironic, and further criticised Thatcher's favouring of Samuel Smilestyle's values, such as self-help, whilst also expressing unease at Thatcher's third term in government, which made her the longest continuously serving Prime Minister since Lord Liverpool in the early 19th century. However, although the piece was heavily revised post the signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 to make Britain appear even more villainous in the wake of Thatcher's third term in government, the critics still proclaimed that, in the words of Mark Gould, as a thought-provoking satire on imperialism and greed, which is how it is billed, it falls down, because even the serious bits are funnier. So, to conclude, with its focus on the Opium War between Britain and China, productions of Poppy sought to expose the darker side of patriotism, and by way of pantomime, asked their audiences to consider their identity as inheritors of Britain's colonial past. As Billington wrote of Poppy in 1982, pantomime, with its moral certainties, built-in chauvinism and defiant swagger, is both an apt metaphor for those Victorian values Mrs. T would have us resurrect, and also a suitable vehicle for the story of the British East India Company's druggy exploitation of the Chinese trade routes. In a decade in which Zimbabwe, Vanuatu and Belize received their independence, and which Canada achieved patriation, Poppy depicted the harsh reality of imperialism, as its quasi-fictitious narrative linked and made comparison between these two ages of Victoria and Thatcher, by way of the two women's relationship with Hong Kong. Not only was Britain coping with the loss of its colonies during the 1980s, it was also suffering from its own identity crisis, as debates about the failure of multiculturalism suggested that rather than move on from the present had merely inherited and reproduced it. Poppy sought to expose some of the mechanics behind the racist construction of others and Orientalism, and in subverting many of pantomime genre conventions, the production successfully criticised Britain's actions, both past and present. In today's pantomime season of myriad Aladdins, political pantomime may well be behind us. But Nichols' Poppy demonstrates the genre can still be used for political means, even if Poppy's audiences, much like their Victorian counterparts, weren't all too aware of the production's hidden message. Thank you.